Thank you. Mr. Lapointe, one just follow up from yesterday's session, I wanted to just clarify. When you talked about, when we were discussing overescapement, and you talked about that you didn't think that the word overescapement was a good terminology, and you talked a little bit about benchmarks. If you had agreement on different benchmarks, that would help you to decide whether there was the right escapement. That word benchmark has some meaning in terms of wild salmon policy and in terms of the frizzy model, and I'm wondering, is the benchmark concept that you were talking about one of those two types of benchmarks, or is it something altogether different?
Sorry about that. I'd forgotten, bad choice of words. I'd forgotten how many days you actually spent on the wild salmon policy, so let me try to be a little bit more precise in that language, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify it. What I was trying to get at was that if it was possible, a concept, and it's a concept, okay, it's not an answer, it's not a recommendation or anything, is that if we could define, and I'll use this word, and if you need me to help refine the definition of this, I can try, but it's going to be a bit vague. If we could define something akin to optimal escapement in the context of the various benefits that Fraser sockeye or salmon in general provide, and by the various benefits, I gave examples yesterday, but just to pick two, I guess, of the many that so if we could define what the optimal escapement was with respect to something like biodiversity, and I think that probably John Reynolds, in one of his testimonies early on, provided the best definition, a better definition than I could have of that, versus the optimal escapement for something like sustainable yield. And not only the optimum, but also how deviations from the optimum would impact those two topics. So more escapement or less escapement relative to that optimum in those two objectives. Then I think it would go a long way towards articulating kind of the goalposts, if you like, about some of the debate. And right now, I think there's a bit of ambiguity about those in some cases, and it kind of muddies the waters a bit in our ability to communicate clearly about that topic. So, I'm not saying that it's trivial exercise to do that in any way, and I'm not even necessarily saying it has to be measured in some sort of a number type of a thing, because that's always something that can create some problems. But just a very careful, even verbal description would improve our ability to communicate along the issues of overescapement, in my view. So that's really where I was coming from.
All right, and not the use of the word benchmarks was not intended to reference either of the other benchmarks?
No, absolutely not.
Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about Alaska, and I wanted to talk about the impacts, if any, of the ITQ fisheries, which on the management of Fraser River sockeye. So I think I'll start with that one, actually.
That's a good idea, actually, I think.
We talked a little bit about ITQ fisheries when we looked at the fisheries planning model, and you described how this is a type of fishery that sets a quota for a period rather than just opening it up for a period of time. And that contrasts with the derby fishery. And I take it that the ITQ fishery was tried this year. This was in 2010. That was the first year that's actually been implemented as a
yes,
trial.
that's correct.
Okay. Does that and it wasn't implemented for all fisheries, just some?
Yeah, there were only agreements for Area B, which is seine, and Area H, which is troll. I believe that actually there were some pilot studies in a couple of those instances, very small-scale ones prior to last year, but the first full-scale implementation, or full-scale, I guess, season-wide, fleet-wide, was last year.
Okay. Does that move, if it's to be continued to an ITQ fishery, does that impact how the Fraser River panel can manage the fisheries, or does it impact the Salmon Commission staff work in terms of the information they gather and how they actually make decisions? So
I spoke yesterday about the stock ID implications, so I won't repeat that because that's already in the record. But I would talk about two, I think, other aspects. One is the manageability of the fishery, and by that it's mostly about the risk. And I got to be a little bit careful about how I word this, just because ITQ has a bunch of economic implications about the sharing of quotas and the ability of folks to buy them, and some folks have some sensitivities about what the implications might be for the independent operator versus the licenses that are owned by companies and so forth. So I don't know that my comments are really about that part of it. That's really outside.
I'm not asking you about that.
It's important for me to clarify, because people might think if I'm a proponent of that I somehow am a proponent of the economic parts, and that's outside my expertise, so I just want to be clear about that. But on the manageability side, the important aspect of it that may not necessarily be a function of the ITQ in a literal sense is that the fishermen are able to fish in a pool towards a catch target. In other words, there's a defined catch target, which in contrast to the derby style, it's a defined fishing time with an unknown catch outcome that relates in part to the abundance of the fish and the success of the fishermen and how good the weather is and all those kinds of things. So by having it be a catch target, then it provides two things. One, some certainty about the risk in relation to the magnitude of the catch. And it also provides some capacity to access available harvests of different magnitudes. In other words, if there's a situation where the available harvest is relatively small, in the past, with only the ability to regulate effort, it might have been impossible to structure an opening short enough to have some assurance that the catch would be within the target. I mean, we have had, I think, 2 or 3 hour Area E openings, and I suppose one could contemplate a 1 hour seine opening, but it's not practical. Whereas now, because the catch is shared and pooled, if the target is 30,000 fish, you don't have to put a seine fleet of 170 boats out there to catch that 30,000 fish. You can send 10 boats out. They're fishing to a target. When they get their 30,000, they stop, and the benefits are shared through the ITQ. So that's the primary, those two benefits. The idea that even on a big quota situation, you have a focused harvest that reduces the risk, and on a small harvest, you can access that. It's kind of like a finer volume knob on the stereo. If before it was kind of like full on or full off. And I expect if you ask some of the industry guys about this, they would say, why didn't we get to go fishing? It's because they didn't have enough graduations on the knob to allow them to go fishing on the derby style. So in fact, they didn't go fishing because you couldn't take the risk. Policy folks couldn't take that risk. So those are the fundamental things from a fisheries management side I'd bring up on the ITQ issue. Thanks.
And then the other area I wanted to cover with you was Alaska. There's been comparisons made between the Fraser River system and Bristol Bay in particular. First of all, do you have any knowledge of what the fisheries regime is in Alaska, and can you draw any comparisons with the BC Fraser River system?
Sure. So first of all, the shortest answer to your question is that the information about Bristol Bay is widely known, freely available, and fairly well understood, in my view. Okay, and part of that relates to, and this may be a bad word, but I suspect you guys have experienced this in part of your process here, is that the fisheries world is pretty incestuous. We all know each other. We all have come from different places, and it's pretty hard to meet someone who hasn't, that you don't know or doesn't know someone you know in the fisheries world. I mean, it's very much that way. And in my own personal experience, and I have to say, Mr. Commissioner, that when I answer this, I'm afraid that it may sound too good to be true, and you may question the objectivity of my previous testimony. My personal experience, my connections to Bristol Bay are kind of, I don't know if they're unusual, they're probably typical, but just to give you an example of how small the world is, I originally started a master's program at the University of Alaska in 1982 at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. So I actually lived in Alaska for a short period. And in the course of my field work for that program, I did field work with a gentleman named Doug Meekum. And excuse me if this sounds like a bunch of name dropping. I'm not trying to build up my expertise in Bristol Bay by any stretch, but just to kind of give you an idea of how small the world is. Well, I'm not going to go through Doug's career for you, but Doug retired about 6 or 7 years ago from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game as the director of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And I actually made a reconnection with him because he's now a member of the Northern Boundary Restoration and Enhancement Fund, the Pacific Salmon Commission. I hadn't seen him for over 20 years, although we did have some interactions over the course of his career. So, I mean, that's kind of a happenstance. The reason I left Alaska, and I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I got a phone call from a guy named Ray Holborn, and Ray wanted me to come down to UBC to do a master's program there. Well, Ray, as I'm sure many of you know, is now on the faculty of the University of Washington, and he is the main scientist involved with a lot of the Bristol Bay research on Bristol Bay sockeye. Fast forward through a lot of tough years of trying to finish my degree, and I end up at Simon Fraser University working for Randall Peterman, and you have my CV that was entered into the record yesterday, and you'll see a couple publications on there from that 4-year stint working with Randall, and some of them relate to comparisons between the productivities of Bristol Bay sockeye and Fraser River sockeye. I think the text probably says, British Columbia and Alaska, because you always try to be more general in your academic titles and so forth on these papers, but my recollection of that, and please don't embarrass me and ask me about the details of those papers. I think they were published in 1990s sometime, early 90s. I won't remember. But things I do remember about that is in dealing with the data sets for Bristol Bay, the one thing that really strikes me when I first saw them was I looked at the columns. There were columns for the number of spawners and the number of returns, and the number of returns were split out by age class. And I looked at the Bristol Bay file, and where did all these ages come from? I mean, there were ages I'd never seen before, and it was like this frustration of doing that work. And I'm going to come back to the age issue later on when I talk more generally about the issue. And then, so that work with Randall, and it just kind of, right now in the current, obviously Alaska is a party to the treaty. There are seine fishermen that fish in Bristol Bay and come down and fish in the Fraser, that are part of the Fraser panel process. They fish in both places because the Bristol Bay season is earlier. We've had members of the Fraser panel that also were part of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. There's this tendency on the U.S. side because Alaska had a 20-year retirement deal where if you work 20 years, you retire with full pension. Many of those folks actually finished their 20 years and got hired by the federal government and ended up connected to the Fraser panel process. And actually Doug is one of those folks. He's now working for the federal government, kind of double dipping as it were, but good for them. So that's my personal connection to those. And the only reason I bring that up is not so much to, as I said, establish that I'm an expert. That's not the point. But the point is that my take is that if there was something that I was fundamentally missing, or we were fundamentally missing on the Fraser, one of those folks would probably, call me up and kind of grab me by the shoulders and give my head a shake, sort of saying, "Hello, are you paying attention? You were my student. So, and it's not like Fraser sockeye issues have not been in the public domain, right? So there've been lots, they read newspapers, they see stuff. So that's the kind of interconnectedness, an example of the interconnectedness of all of us that work on salmon. Now, I do want to speak more generally about the Bristol Bay and provide you some, not to convince you of my knowledge, but to provide some high-level observations, I guess I would say, from what I know. And I want to speak about three main themes. The first one relates to geography. The second one relates to fisheries management. And the third one relates to biology. So those three themes. Now I'll start with geography, and of the three themes, I think that the geography and the biology are the drivers, and the fisheries management's kind of a reaction, I guess, to those two things, as it should be. On the geography side, first, everyone know where Bristol Bay is? The map of Alaska, if my arm is kind of the Aleutian Islands, and the Alaska Peninsula is here, and Bristol Bay is kind of where my neck is here, all right? So above the Aleutians, north of the Alaska Peninsula, right near the, almost part of the Bering Sea, basically, above the Alaska Peninsula is the Bering Sea, below is the Gulf of Alaska. So that's where Bristol Bay is. One of the most fundamental differences between Fraser sockeye and Bristol Bay with respect to geography is that in Bristol Bay there's multiple stocks, and a number of those stocks have different points of ocean entry with respect to where those stocks migrate out to sea and where they come back and enter into the rivers to return home to spawn. There's about 6 or 8 major entry points across the Bristol. So Bristol Bay is not a river. It's a geographic location with a whole bunch of streams. The Fraser has a whole bunch of streams, but the important distinction is that the streams in Bristol Bay spill out about 8 different major spots over an area of about 200 kilometers. And just for a point of reference, 200 kilometers is about the distance between Vancouver and Seattle, 220, something like that. Okay, so Fraser, of course, has one main stem stream that spills out in one location. It may have the same number of individual streams that contribute to it, but it doesn't have the advantage of that, or the difference, advantage, I think it's an advantage, but of the multiple points of ocean entry from all the streams that contribute to Bristol Bay. So clearly that geography is a fact of nature. It's not something we can change, but it does influence the kinds of things you can do in a fisheries management sense. A few minor things on the geography, just because sometimes people think this is kind of a cause as opposed to just an effect. I think the driver in the geography is the stream entry point. Bristol Bay is very remote. I suspect the largest city on any of these streams in Bristol Bay would probably be Dillingham, and it's a population as of the 2008 census of about 2,500 people. Now, I suspect it's significantly larger than that during the fishing season, but you know, it's a lot smaller than Vancouver. It's only located around one of those entry points. I'm not that familiar with how much forestry is done up there, but I would suspect that the ecosystems would be relatively pristine relative to many parts of British Columbia, certainly the Fraser Valley and some parts of the interior. So that's an issue. There's also the issue of warm water, okay? Bristol Bay streams have not experienced the warming trend that has occurred in the Fraser River. Okay, just hasn't gotten that far north yet, and that obviously is a big player in the Fraser. On the jurisdictional side, and I think this is a bit of a red herring, but it is simpler up there. There is just the state of Alaska with some interactions with the federal government, and one of the things I learned when I was in Alaska was that something about those interactions, and let's just say that I think the state kind of drives the show up there, and the feds are kind of potentially viewed a little bit as a nuisance, if I could use that word, but I might get myself in trouble with my Alaskan colleagues in making that remark, but that would not be a unfair characterization in my view of what I both personally observed and what I understand to be the case. But some folks have tried to draw the conclusion in the Fraser that maybe if the jurisdiction was simpler, everything would be solved. And I guess I would say the jurisdiction is definitely more complex and it's a challenge, but it's really not, in my view, the issue. But there has been some folks that feel that way, so I'm happy to be challenged. So that's all I had to say about the geography. Turning to the fish management, first of all, escapement policy. Try not to get too technical about this, but there's two major basic strategies that one can use to determine the number of fish that you'd like to have escape. One of them is called a fixed escapement policy. And the concept behind that one is that no matter what the run size is, the escapement is a number, period. It is whatever the escapement target is. The other one is a fixed exploitation rate strategy, and the concept there is that the escapement will vary as a fixed fraction of the total run. So a fixed proportion of the total run instead of a fixed number. There's lots of theoretical papers on this. I'm not going to go into great detail on it. My knowledge is a little bit foggy, but two comments I will make relate to the fact that the fixed escapement policy has theoretically been shown to result in higher long-term yield, but greater variation between years. Whereas the fixed exploitation rate strategy results in lower long-term yield, but more stable yields over time. Two really categorical differences between those that have fairly well accepted concepts. So what happens in Bristol Bay? Well, in Bristol Bay, they have a fixed escapement policy. Basically, it's a fixed number. And I can talk about how the fisheries relates to that shortly, but in the Fraser, I think there's because, and you're going to get a whole day or two more than you want probably on frizzy, so I don't want to preempt that at all, but from what I know about frizzy process, and I do implement it on a daily basis in the summer, at some ranges of run size below what's called the cutoff point, the upper cutoff point, it's a fixed escapement policy. It doesn't look like one because there's this shape drawn, but it is indeed algebraically, mathematically, however you want to define it, a fixed escapement policy. So where they differ is at big run sizes. At big run sizes, the policy of the frizzy model says there's a cap on the exploitation rate or on the total mortality rate. It's a 60% cap, I think, right now. So what that means is that beyond some abundance level defined by the cutoff point, you're in a fixed escapement rate strategy mode, or a fixed exploitation rate, strategy mode. So it's kind of a hybrid between the two. There's an interaction here between the geography and these strategies, in my view. In other words, I believe that one reason why they may be different is the fact that the geographies are different. What would be the implications for the Fraser of a fixed escapement policy at all run sizes? It's the same implication it would be anywhere else. As the run size goes up, the exploitation rate goes up because the escapement target is fixed, and what goes to catch is the balance. So the catch goes up, right? The catch part of that, it's a zero-sum game here. So if the escapement is a fixed number, and the catch goes up, and the abundance goes up, then the catch part of that has to increase because they add to the total run, right? So that means that at high abundance levels, the literal interpretation of a fixed escapement plan would be you would increase the exploitation rates to represent whatever the balance of the catch is left from subtracting that catch from the total run. You apply that kind of a strategy in the Fraser, and I'll try to, as you know, I try to be careful about making value judgments, but one of the concerns that's been expressed in the Fraser consequence, or context as a consequence of the geography, is that because 99.9% of Fraser sockeye are currently harvested in a mixed stock way. In other words, I'm defining it very strictly. In other words, there's very few fisheries directed at single stocks, okay? Is that you need to be concerned about, or people have expressed concern about, the fact that the exploitation rates that can be sustained by different stocks may be different. And so that's one of the reasons why I believe there is a cap on the total mortality rate for Fraser sockeye. Is this, you turn that over to Bristol Bay and look at Bristol Bay's geography, they have more or less some capability, and in fact, this is the last part of the fisheries management thing I'll describe to you. They take advantage of the geography. Their fisheries are located pretty close to the mouths of the 6 or 8 streams that empty into Bristol Bay, and so they have a capability as a function of the geography that allows them to be a little bit more stock specific in the way that they harvest these fish, and that's what they do. So the risk to Bristol Bay sockeye of having, say, fixed escapement strategy is mitigated by the geography that allows them to be a little bit more selective in their harvest, okay? So the only other thing I'll say on the fisheries management side, and then I'll end with the biology, is that the in-season tactics are somewhat similar to what we do in the Fraser, but somewhat different because of the geography. So they fish in terminal areas near the stream mouths, and they can control the effort in each of these areas depending upon whether certain component stocks are weak and those drainages are strong. And they have these counting towers, visual towers on the streams where they get the index of abundance, and they're only about 3 days distance swim from where the fishing takes place, so they have a very immediate in-season feedback about how they're going, how they're tracking relative to their escapement targets. So that's pretty similar to the hydroacoustic station at Mission, except there's more than one of them. The difference is that our fisheries, under the current allocation, are much more seaward, right? They're 6 to 8 days seaward. In the case of the marine commercial fisheries, the allocations are more seaward. So the in-season tactics are similar. I would actually suggest, because we have to be this way, and interaction I've had more recently with Ray is consistent with this, that we're probably a bit more sophisticated in our in-season assessments because we have more seaward fisheries. We have to have more developed test fisheries. They're just starting to develop their genetics right now for their one test fishery, the Port Muller test fishery. So we've had some interaction with them. It's been us kind of telling them our experience and them telling us their experience. So that's all in the fisheries management. Now the biology, if I had to pick one of these three that is the fundamental driver, it would be the biology. And it relates back to my little comment about my dilemma when I was working for Randall way back when, and it's the age. There's a very excellent paper, I don't know if you guys have it in Ringtail, written by Dan Schindler. I have it with me, and I'm happy to provide it. Published in 2002 in Nature. Schindler, Hilborn, Tom Quinn, there's a whole bunch of authors. I don't remember them all. And it has to do with the portfolio effect in Bristol Bay sockeye. Really good overview, actually, paper. That paper does a great job of documenting the importance of age variation to the robustness of the biology of Bristol Bay sockeye. It says the portfolio effect, and there is an element related to stock. I don't want to say there's not an element related to stock, but what I will say from some conversations I have had with some folks is that I think if you read the paper carefully, I think you'll see most of the robustness is coming from age, not from stock. There's one figure in that paper, figure 1C, and it describes the variation in abundance. If you just looked at the variation of a single stock, the variation of multiple stocks, and similarly the variation of a single age class across the stocks, or the variation of all the age classes and all the stocks combined. And what it shows, if you just look at the stock effect and account for the reduction in the variation in total return that's associated with that, it ends up giving you a CV of about 100%. Now, how can I describe this to you in a way that you'll understand? And I'm not trying to be negative about your capacity. It's just that I realize that it's a bit of jargon, okay? A CV of 100% would be analogous to having the median run size be one value and say the 75 p-value being half and the 25 p-value being double, just to give you an idea of a concept of that. As soon as you incorporate the age variation and the stock variation combined, it drops to 30%, from 100% to 30%. Fraser sockeye, just to remind you what I talked to you about back in October, have one primary age class in the freshwater, one primary age class that enters freshwater. The smolts enter, most of them enter, almost all of them enter the sea after 1 year in the lake, right? And one primary adult return age class, age 4. The offspring come back 4 years later. Some come back as 5s. I don't want to. It's not a 100%, okay, but it's mostly 4. Bristol Bay has at least 2 primary freshwater age classes. A fair fraction of the fish spend 1 year in the lake, and a fair fraction spend 2 years in the lake. They have about 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6s, and occasionally the odd 7 on the adult return side. That was my kind of dilemma as working for Randall. I was like, holy smokes, I set up this file to work this way and there's all these extra ages, what do I do, and I really remember vividly encountering that challenge. So the portfolio effect is absolutely real. I mean, you can think of it in the context of 2009. What would a 2009 return been like if the 2009 causes are related to something in the ocean? And I don't want to prejudge that conclusion. And I know that's part of what you're going to look at a little later on, and we've got some reports to read and so forth. And we had returns from 2009 that resulted from not just ocean entry in 07, but another year of ocean entry. And that year wasn't quite as bad. Well, then I suspect that we would have had a little bit of a buffer from that, whatever it was that affected that 2007 ocean entry year, right? Similarly, on the adult return side, now Bristol Bay doesn't have these temperature things that we have in the Fraser, but if something impacts one spawning group returning, say the 2004 group, that adult age class, and they hit hot water or something, then 4 years from now, you can pretty well predict, and I'm warning the Fraser panel about 2012 and stuff in this context, that you're not going to get a good return because it's all in one basket. The eggs are in one basket, so to speak. Bristol Bay, some of those fish are going to spawn in 1 year, some are going to spawn in another year, so the offspring come from a whole bunch of environmental experiences, if you like, both in the marine and in the spawning areas. It's much more buffered. And so that's my summary, I guess, of the principal issues with respect to Bristol Bay. And I think those are the ones I focus on. And I think that the key one to me is the age. The geography obviously feeds into the management. It's an important player. But the reason that Bristol Bay have been sort of more robust is that their resource has been granted a bit more evolutionary tools, so to speak, than the Fraser sockeye, and we got to live with what we got. I'd like to say that we could make Fraser sockeye more diverse in age, but that's kind of outside of anyone's power, I think.
Other management option I wanted to review with you, and there's been some talk about increasing the fisheries in river in recent years. Would that, if there was a move to more in river fisheries, would that change any management impacts from your perspective working with the Pacific Salmon Commission?
You like to ask me difficult questions, don't you? It's not that difficult, but it's just, I really would prefer not to get into kind of a speculation situation in terms of the future, because then you have to pull out a scenario and ask a what if, and any scenario you pull off. But I will answer. I just want to be careful about getting too far out in front. And I think the way I prefer to answer it is to just simply say that we've already had some changes in the in-river fisheries that have occurred since '92. I think you've had discussions about those, and so far, the Fraser panel has coped with those. I mean, it's not like the process has grinded to a screaming halt because of the changes that have occurred. Okay, so I think that we just have to acknowledge the fact that there have been some decisions made, and we have the Fraser panel has coped with implementing those policies. And I think so far we've done okay. Now, I'm sure that some would take some exception about the impacts to them. Okay, but I don't really want to get into the impacts to different groups. The only point that I raised yesterday that I would perhaps flag, and just because it is in the record already, and it's not about any particular group in the river, is the skier temperature interaction. It doesn't matter who is fishing. Like if it's a sport fishery, if it's the Area E or the Aboriginal groups, it's the potential of the gear fishery interaction that in association with temperature that will simply, in my view, cause us to think about the manner in which we harvest these fish. It's not about the geography. Geography is like one of the biggest complications in this whole thing. It's just about the biology of a fish encountering anything that makes the fish's life more difficult in a warm environment creates a challenge. It might be heaven forbid, a dam or something like that, but it's not. So that's the thing. The only thing I'd say, and in the context of your question, then, if in thinking about the future, we're just going to have to deal with that. It's going to be a challenge to think about how to meld whatever the future is in that context.
The first
Excuse me, I just wonder, I don't know, Mr. Commissioner, if this is appropriate, but there are a couple things that on the overescapement issue that I didn't get to yesterday, and I wondered if it would be okay if I would just make a few more comments, but I'm okay with just going to cross. I don't want to take any more time on the testimony than has been taken already.
I'm fine if that is...
Okay, there's only two, and there's no graphs, I promise. The first one relates to a report that's out on this issue, and it's I think the title of the report is called "Does Overescapement Cause Stock Collapse?" It's often referenced in regards to this issue, and I actually don't take any particular issues with the report. Okay, I want to be clear about that, or the authors. I mean, the authors are Carl Walters and Brian Riddle, both of whom are going to be here before you, and so it's not about the report per se. What it's about is the context in which that report has sometimes been referred to. Like, I think that report does a pretty good job of addressing one very specific issue, the issue of stock collapse in the context of overescapement. Okay, so, but it's only one, and I think in my experience in seeing references to this report, I quite often see a reference to the effect of there are no issues associated with overescapement, and then parentheses, PFRCC 2004. People have overgeneralized the conclusions from that report, and I flag it because there are lots of other issues, and I don't want to really get into the issues, but just to bring this point home a little bit, I would offer you this example. Let's say you come home from work and one of your children comes to you and says, "Hey, Mom or Dad, I saw this really cool report on the internet, and the title of the report is Children Who Don't Do Their Homework Don't Fail." And I think we all react to that differently depending upon our parenting skills and so forth. But I think one way we probably would react is that we would probably say to our child that we think there's a higher goal than not failing associated with not doing our homework. I don't think many of us would say, "Don't do your homework." So the analogy I would draw to this report, and it's not a negative on the report, but it's a negative on how it's been used, in my view, by some, and it's not, maybe they haven't read the report. I don't know. I mean, you Google search over-escapement, you get a hit, and you go, there's a report on over-escapement. We're kind of lazy that way these days. Is that I think that no one would accept management of Fraser sockeye with only the objective to avoid stock collapse. We ask more of folks like me in terms of what our objectives are. So that does not mean the report is irrelevant. It does not mean it's not germane. It is very germane, but it doesn't help. It's not specific enough towards whatever the objectives are for management of Fraser sockeye. It doesn't address all of those objectives, and so it's just a cautionary note. I suspect it'll come up in your discussions. There's other things that we want this, and it doesn't, and it's clear in the report. You read the report, it specifically says we didn't address A, B, C, D. We addressed this one. So that's just that one on that report. The other one relates to the statement I made yesterday about issuing some sort of a challenge to kind of help understand the context of the over-escapement debate with respect to all the benefits. And we need to understand this. Well, I want to be clear that I'm not trying to add to the list of things that DFO is being asked to do. I'm sure that in the wild salmon policy testimony, there's a lot of things on their list. Certainly, part of the responsibility falls with DFO, but I personally think it's a little bit hypocritical to be a proponent of that kind of those diverse views and not, roll up your sleeves and grab a shovel and pitch in. There are things to be offered by people outside of DFO, and both academically and idea-wise, that we shouldn't all dump on DFO. I think that's a mistake. I think it's a hindrance of the progress. I think better outcomes would come from broader participation, and I think that along those lines, I guess I'll just finish by saying one of my best mentors, I guess, when I was a graduate student was a guy named Norman Wolomovsky. And Norman was an ichthyologist, but he taught a course in fisheries management. He had a lot of peculiar personality traits, including his classes were always with the door open, and it got pretty cold in there. There was one year we had 2 students from Bangladesh, and boy, I felt bad for them. They had toques on and mitts and wool jackets and everything. But one of the things that Norm said, which I've carried with me throughout my career, and it has to be at least close to 30 years ago now when I heard this first, is he said there's no limit to what you can do if you're not concerned about who gets the credit. And maybe I would turn that around a little bit and paraphrase it slightly and say something to the effect of, focus on self-interest limits our capacity to make progress on issues of mutual concern. Now, I know this isn't a, Fraser sockeye focus group. Clearly it's not. But I do think part of the essence of the, if we feel like we're stuck in the mud, part of the issue is that there aren't enough of us pushing the vehicle here. And not only that, the folks that are pushing the vehicle are getting told to push the vehicle in about 15 different directions. Now, that may be a little bit philosophical, it may be naive, it may be, kind of sound a bit like a sermon, I'm not sure, but it's an observation I would make from what I observe. And yeah, I'm kind of on the outside looking in to some extent. I'm not really on the outside looking in, but I'm not really on the inside. But if you go back and read some of the remarks that Paul Sprout made when he came, and he talked about the context of making decisions in the contours of environment of the Fraser. Paul is definitely someone who was making those decisions. He was responsible for those decisions. He was, I think of him as Commissioner Sprout because he was a commissioner, but obviously he was the regional director general. If you read that, just those few comments, and I think it was in the context of the gravel issue, I think you'll see some very common themes from someone who was on the inside of that, very much involved, more involved than I am. And so, I've been in the process of knowing that I was going to be here and thinking about this for quite some time. I've had these thoughts kind of swirling in my head, if you like, on my bike rides home and so forth. And I just thought, I doubt that I'm telling you something that you don't know, sir. I'm sure you've intuited it from the proceedings thus far, but I really think that that's one of those fundamental things, When I look out this group, maybe I have to squint a little bit sometimes. I see a team, but I don't see a group of people acting like a team. I see a group of people that maybe are acting like a team that's on a losing streak, and it's like the hockey team where the centerman's telling, the wingers are complaining the centerman's not passing the puck, and the centerman's complaining that the defenseman can't make a breakout pass, and the goalie's saying the defenseman can't clear the puck. I mean, it's like, that's what happens to teams when they go through change, and that's what's happened to this team. So the challenge then is to get us in the royal us sense, thinking about each other as teammates, kind of not looking for mortar to reinforce the bricks in our silo, but in fact try to figure out a way to get rid of those silos and start working together. And I don't think anyone can expect you or DFO or anyone else or any coach to get you to play together. It's going to have to be a decision that you want to play together and you want to work together and you believe that that's a path towards a better solution. So I'm going to stop now. I've said enough, and I'm going to answer cross-examination questions.
Okay, thank you. The first counsel examined, Mr. Lapointe, is his counsel for the Salmon Commission.
Mr. Commissioner, I'm Brent Johnston. I appear for the Pacific Salmon Commission. I'm here in place of John Hunter this week. I have no questions for Mr. Lapointe.
Thank you. And then the next counsel would be Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
Mr. Commissioner, for the record, Hugh McCauley for the Government of Canada. Mr. Lapointe, I just have a few questions. One of them arises from a response that you offered yesterday morning, I think it was, to Ms. Baker with respect to management adjustments. I'll come to that in a minute.
Okay.
Just a clarification issue.
Sure.
And then I wanted to ask you some general questions about some of the concepts that have been spoken to in some of the testimony to date, concepts like biodiversity, which you yourself have spoken to in part yesterday afternoon, and ecosystem-based management. I'll come back to those.
Okay, sure.
In response to a question from Ms. Baker yesterday morning, you indicated that the use of management adjustments is unique to the Fraser system. First, I just wanted to make sure I understood your testimony on that. Is that correct?
I'm not aware of another salmon situation in the world where there is the removal of fish from available harvest in reaction to potential mortality in the way that it's done in the Fraser.
And I guess what I'm getting at is, in terms of seeking some clarification here, is this because of the en route loss issue that you've spoken to, or is this because of data being available in the Fraser system through the mission hydroacoustic operation, et cetera, that allows for the difference between estimates calculations to be made?
I would say both. I would actually say both.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. Turning then to just, again, some concepts that Mr. Commissioner has heard about from other witnesses, and with respect to biodiversity, as I say, you've spoken to it yourself. How is the protection of biodiversity for Fraser sockeye reflected in the work of the Pacific Salmon Commission?
Strictly in our work, I would say it would be in the nature of the way that decisions are made. Decisions are made in a very sequential form. Fisheries decisions early in the season are there's a fair amount of precaution made in terms of getting fisheries started. And then I guess the broader context, I guess, would be in the context of the objectives that we're asked to manage to. And so to the extent that the escapement policies that are provided to us by Canada respond to biodiversity, and I'll talk about two of those, and I know you're going to spend some days on this, so I suspect you'll learn more about this than I can provide you. Within the context of the escapement policy, there's two things, one of which I just mentioned, which was the maximum total mortality rate that applies at larger run sizes. That's clearly a reflection of the need to protect the differential productivities of stocks, some maximum beyond which there could be certain stocks that would be adversely impacted. The second way is a little bit more subtle, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to explain it very well, but there are benchmarks within the spawning initiative model for the 19 populations, and clearly part of the evaluation of which alternative total allowed mortality rule would be selected includes performance measures that relate to the probabilities of individual stocks. In some cases, they're actually subsets of CUs. In some cases, they would be more or less parallel to CUs. What is the impact of a particular option on the probability of those populations being above some benchmark, where benchmark is more in the wild salmon policy context that you guys heard about before. Those would be the sort of the comments I would offer.
I appreciate that the mandate of the Pacific Salmon Commission is about salmon. Is the concept of eco-based management reflected in the work of the PSC?
There are, at the PSC level, outside the PSC staff, discussions ongoing about habitat and other factors. There's some habitat papers. The Restoration Fund's habitat, a range of projects that include habitat. Yeah, I think there's lots of aspects of what we do that implicitly, perhaps, but not explicitly, include aspects of the ecosystem in them. It's not very well articulated, perhaps, and that's one of the things that I think we all could do a better job, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to help you out immediately right now. But yeah, I do think it is part of it. And the only other comment I'd say about ecosystem-based management is that sometimes I think, and I'm not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing, but sometimes I think we have a tendency to think of the ecosystem from the window of an Apollo orbiting spaceship and looking down at the Earth and trying to remove ourselves from it. In other words, we kind of don't acknowledge the fact that, part of the ecosystem is us. And we have a big impact on it. And now that's not to say that the ecosystem should be managed for us necessarily, although perhaps there are cases where it is. It's just to say that we are part of the ecosystem, and so I think that sometimes is lost, and sometimes when I hear discussions on this topic.
Thank you. Another comment as heard testimony about is a precautionary approach to fisheries management. Again, how is the precautionary approach reflected in the work of the Pacific Salmon Commission?
I'm not an expert on that topic. I actually have a paper with me that discusses some of the elements of the precautionary approach, and I couldn't recite them all for you. But again, I think in the harvest management policies that are developed, there's an element of precaution associated with those. In our approach to the sequence of fisheries that we plan in the Fraser River panel and the way that they are triggered or not, depending upon the in-season data flow, there's an element of precaution. There isn't, as yet, and I'm not saying there should be, any formal quantitative risk-based management use of uncertainty. In other words, uses of probabilities in any explicit way in the management context. As I said yesterday, I've been trying to build the tools within the PSC staff to provide and quantify as best we can those uncertainties. But as yet, it's not. It's more intuitive. It's more based on experience. And to me, 2009 is probably a very good example of an outcome that happens as a result of an escapement policy and a very poor run. I've kind of tried to wipe 2009 from my brain to some extent because it's not necessarily happy memories in terms of the resource, but what happened in 2009? We had a small run. We detected it early. There was about an 8% of the run that was harvested, and that went to test fisheries that were designed to detect whether we had a problem in the first place, and FSC fisheries, and 92% of the run was made available for escapement. I don't remember in detail, but I don't recall. So my experience in Fraser sockeye management, the 20 years I've been involved, is that when the fish are really in trouble, people do the right thing. When they're really in trouble, they do. I mean, there were no nets wrapped around Burrard Street office last summer. There weren't people on the Fraser River saying, having protest fisheries. And it's easy for me to say because all I did was deliver bad news. Some of those folks didn't get the amount of food that they would otherwise have wanted to have. Some of those folks didn't make the payments on their debt because they didn't have any income. So it's partly the management strategy, but the most important thing is I think people give a darn about these fish and they act appropriately when they're asked to do so. And I think 2009 is 100% excellent example, most recent one, but there are many others I could point to in the past of that ethic that's here on this coast.
In response to contact and information sharing between the Pacific Salmon Commission and Department of Fisheries and Oceans, could you describe in general terms the working relationship between the PSC and DFO?
I would describe it as excellent. I would describe it as collaborative, cooperative, excellent. Probably at amongst the best it's been since I've been a member of the Pacific Salmon Commission. It's been that way for about 6, 7, 8 years now.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
The next council is Mr. Buchanan, who is not here. Rio Tinto, David Bursey, I think he's here. Pacific Salmon Farmers Association.
BC Salmon Farmers Association.
Oh, sorry,
we have no questions.
Did I say something else? Sorry. Seafood Producers Association of BC, Mr. Walden. No. Aquaculture Coalition, Mr. McDade. No. Mr. Leadham for the Conservation Coalition.
For the record, Leadham initial T appearing as counsel for the Conservation Coalition. I'd like to have a discussion with you, Mr. Lapointe, rather than a cross-examination. I'm mindful of your last words that you gave in direct about pushing the truck out of the mud, and I like to be one of those that's helping to push the truck out rather than digging it in deeper. I want to start by looking at Exhibit 330, which is the fairly lengthy one. And I want to start by pulling up pages 379 and 380 of that particular exhibit. And if you can look at the bottom of the page, Mr. Lapointe, the context of this is that this appears to be part of a draft that was dated September 17th, 2009, and it appears to be the Pacific Salmon Commission's work plan for 2009-2010. And
That's correct.
at the bottom of page 379, I find outline of other activities of the Fraser River panel for the 2009-2010 cycle.
Yes.
And the first one is Fraser sockeye forecast performance issues. And I find these words: the poor performance of the Fraser sockeye return forecast in 2009 will likely trigger scientific efforts to identify the causes for the poor performance and the developments of ways to improve the forecast. So I want to just stop there because I think those are two important concepts. If you take it that 2009 is an instructive year because we learn from poor returns perhaps much more than we learn from good returns, then obviously one focus of trying to learn as much as we can about what caused that poor return in 2009 will be to discern whether there's any scientific rationale for that. Would you agree with it?
Yeah, what happened?
Yeah.
Sure.
And to that end, one would hope that there would be a lot of scientific thought and study that would go into trying to focus upon the causes for the poor return.
That's correct, and there has been already.
Right, and I'm mindful of the fact that the Simon Fraser University sponsors several workshops on the decline, both last year in December 2009 and March 2010. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then I think your own commission sponsored a workshop in June of 2010.
That's correct. And the report is available on our website and probably among your exhibits here, or among your ringtail documents, I should say.
Right. Now, the other aspect that's in that commentary is improving the forecasts. Are the forecasts always this wonky? Are they always so off?
Well, my answer to that may be a little bit longer. We'll perhaps provide some context, and some of it actually relates to some of the comments I made yesterday, in fact. Prior to about 85, and this relates to the signing of the treaty in 85, forecasts were done by the International Pacific Salmon Fisheries Commission, which was the predecessor to the PSC. I actually is part of the think tank work, and I don't know if it was provided at the workshop that the PSC had, looked at the historical performance of Fraser River sockeye forecasts, and what I found was a pattern that I thought was really peculiar, in that it seemed like there were very few years prior, and I won't get this date exactly right, but prior to around 1985, when there was where the actual return was much less than the forecast. And since I know some of the individuals who were making those forecasts, some people like Jim Moody, for example, I kind of looked at it and went, whereas, just to complete the story, whereas since 85, there's a fairly pronounced tendency for the returns to be less than forecast. Okay, more than half the time. I don't know the exact percentage. And I looked at it and, well, how could that be? Like, that doesn't make any scientific sense to me. So I did what I usually do. I got out the bat phone and called Dr. Woody and talked to him about the history. And what I said to Jim, and I felt a little bad asking this because it wasn't, Jim, you guys didn't like pick a conservative number, did you, for some reason in those years? And he kind of, you'll get to hear him speak here next week or so, kind of cleared his throat as he usually does, and in his very deliberate manner said, well, yes, why is the critical thing. The reason, I think, why, and it goes back to a comment I made yesterday. In the IPSFC days, the fishing plan was announced at the beginning of the year, and in order to alter the plan, you had to have an extraordinary meeting. So those IPSFC guys, they were pretty smart. They said, well, geez, if the run's a lot smaller, we're going to have to trigger an extraordinary meeting, and that's going to create a whole bunch of problems here. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that even though there were statistical methods used, and you maybe could argue the ones we're using now are much more sophisticated and so forth, it wasn't a strict application of a statistical model. There was some judgment used. There would be 3 or 4 pieces of information, and they'd kind of average and rationalize and maybe tend to be a little bit on the low side because of the management context in which they were operating. Now, fast forward to post-85, and there are 2 kinds of changes. One is we have a closed and less open situation with respect to the fisheries that I talked about yesterday. The second thing is there was a move to make sure that there was a scientific consensus about the methodology for forecasts through Canada's PSARC process. Canada assumed responsibility for the forecasts. Science is lauded for its objectivity and transparency, and so the ability for at least the scientists, the biologists, to influence judgment in making their recommendations for forecasts, as was done in the IPSFC years, was greatly diminished. I mean, it would look like you were picking a number for some reason, and think about also picking that number in the political environment of that is Fraser sockeye as well. So the idea was you're going to apply the same statistical model every year, the best model as defined by model performance criteria. So on average, that model should be, because of the way it's evaluated, be high half the time and low half the time. Statistics, right? That's what it's supposed to be. What have we observed, though? What is a lot of the analysis shown about what's happened, in 2009 being the most recent example? We've been in a period of declining productivity. The productivity hasn't been average. It's been declining. So if I was to describe to you why forecasts have tended to be higher in more recent years than they were before, it's those two things. The reason they're higher now is because the models fundamentally assume average productivity, and there's a tendency for it to have been lower. It's not because anyone was picking higher numbers. They were trying to pick the statistically best model, but that best was defined by the long-term average performance. And so in the 2010 forecast, you look at that document, it wasn't a surprise to, this is something that I've been reviewing forecasts now for a number of years within the department, and I don't claim to have, been the, messenger on this way back when, but there was a recognition that that's an assumption. The assumption of average productivity is an assumption, and that one ought to develop forecasts with different scenarios in mind. And so the 2010 forecast reflects that. There's three scenarios. One is average productivity, the same way a forecast has been done for the last 15 years. Another one is declining productivity, and the other one was, well, if it's as bad as 2005 brood year, 2009 return, this is what it is. And so I think that now there's a clear understanding of the fact that the uncertainty about productivity was not necessarily being explicitly included in the past forecast. It was a bit difficult for some of the folks in the science community to accept that because they felt like there was a judgment being made. In other words, there was a judgment. What basis do we have? This is a debate. I was in the room, right? What basis do we have to say that 2010 will be more like 2009 than 1982? If we don't, then we should err on the side of it could be either one of those. And that's the scientific argument against using judgment. I think.
Well, these are all just best guesstimates, aren't they? Until such time as we actually get numbers derived from test fishing.
Yeah,
we're really talking about fish on paper.
I think the forecasts are important for providing context, for providing the range of scenarios used in the contingency planning. I can tell you also in the context of the Bristol Bay question that there is nothing unusually different or better about the forecast methodologies used at Fraser sockeye than Bristol Bay. There's a very large NSERC grant program that was run by Randall Peterman. You can read his papers. There's no magic bullet out there for forecasting. You're right, it's a number on paper. It provides a context. It does, for some folks, probably more than others, set some sort of expectation. There's some element of that. But as I hope we made clear yesterday when we talked, is that it's closed unless open. Fisheries are not opened based on forecasts. They're open based on what the in-season data tell us.
Right. I take some comfort from that. The next item down under the list of things that you're going to do in the report is continue the development of an improved Fraser fishery model. Is that done every year? Do we take the data that we've learned from the year before and then incorporate it into a new model? Is that how it works?
The specific reference to this Fraser fishery model is the preseason planning model that I described in some detail yesterday.
Okay.
And so, as I said yesterday, we have just got a new hire and we want to kind of modernize that. And so that's the reference that's being referred to here. It's more of improving the tool than reactions to particular data flow issues.
Okay. Dropping down, I want to focus on something that you spent a lot of time on yesterday in your direct examination, the late run early entry, about mid-page. And I find these words: the Fraser River panel will receive a report on the information available regarding the 2009 upstream migration behavior of late run sockeye. Have you received that report as of today's date?
It's not a document. It's an annual evaluation of what the late run did in each year. How early did they come up? And in fact, so I guess I would have generated that report because I processed those data. So it's probably a couple of slides in a presentation I would have given to the Fraser panel. The 2009 situation was kind of interesting. We had a very small late run, which in most past years would have meant that we would have had most of the fish come up early, that sort of 2000, 2001 scenario. We actually had, for the first time I can remember, a portion of this very small run delay. And we don't know why. We actually were able to catch some in the Gulf Troll, delaying, so we knew they were there. And we saw a bump of fish come up more in September, more normally timed. And so it may signal a change. Most of the times in past years, we've seen more evidence of delay in the big late run years, like the Adams years, like last year. But in 2009, we actually had a little kind of a glimmer of light, if you like, that maybe some of these fish have figured out that that's not the good thing to do, to come up early. So it was a really positive sign.
So you did not see the expected early.
But what was unique was we saw a portion of the run delay, a larger portion than we would have expected. I don't remember the exact upstream date, but I could certainly find it for you.
So there was still some early entry of that late run with consequential pre-spawn mortality and en route mortality.
Yeah, there was a glimmer of hope, but the behavior is still there and it's still a concern.
Or if this is an appropriate time to take a break.
Thank you. Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.